I've often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and James. This week, we're going to listen to an old clip of our founding president, William F. Buckley Jr., on the topic of academic freedom. The clip was from either 1959 or 1960 in an interview he gave with George Rice Jr., a lawyer and professor of speech at Butler University. But before we get to the interview, first, our ISI member question.
Today, our ISI member question is from Maddie Veldwies. She asks, do you have any advice for students who are thinking about entering fields that are increasingly woke, such as academia and the arts, amidst cancel culture? Johnny, what do you think?
Wow, that's a fantastic question, Maddie. Yeah, I think it has to be a balance between sticking firm to your principles, but at the same time, knowing which battles to fight and which ones to pass on, because you can't die on every hill or else you won't have a job. You have to be a bit strategic about it, and hopefully you can find some good mentors and friends who've lived through what you're going through and have a bit more experience who can help provide some direction for you.
I totally agree. I think mentorship is a very important and key part of that. That's actually one of the things that in another episode we have, Dr. Gelzo talks about is sort of finding that person to help guide you through the academy. And then one other thing I would say is, look for those counter institutions that conservatives are founding, or even, today it's not just conservatives who are anti-woke, right? There's people in sort of moderate left who understand that this woke thing is an issue and they want to allow you to have freedom of speech. So I would say look out for those ways, because that can often be a good time to build a new institution or help a new one.
And that's one of the things that I'm most excited about. Even though everything in the country seems to be headed in the wrong direction, it is encouraging to see a few people on the left who are courageous and who seem to be defending free speech and going out and building their own institutions. And of course, at ISI, we're happy to work with them and partner to advance the causes that we hold dear and believe in. So thanks for that excellent question, Maddie. And for our listeners, if you'd like to submit a question for the next episode, just leave a review of the show wherever you're listening and put your question in that review. Now, on to our interview. William F. Buckley Jr. was the founder of National Review magazine, the host of the popular TV show Firing Line, and the first president of ISI, which at that time was called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. He was the leader of the conservative movement in America for many years, not only through his editorship at National Review, but also through his influence in the 50-plus books of fiction and nonfiction that he wrote over the years. I'd highly encourage you to check out his first book, God and Man at Yale, published in 1951, and dig into his other works as well. If this episode intrigues you and like to know more about Buckley, you can swing over to isi.org/books to pick up a copy of William F. Buckley Jr., The Maker of a Movement by Dr. Lee Edwards. So, James, what's your favorite Buckley book or article?
Yeah, I'm ashamed to say that the only Buckley book I've read is God, Man at Yale, but it's a great one. And my favorite article though is his article in the What is Conservatism book that we publish, Notes Toward an Empirical Definition of Conservatism. And it's fascinating because he sort of says the whole time, you can't really define conservatism. It's a really tough thing. People have been trying for a long time, almost sounding like George Nash would eventually sound in his intro to the conservative intellectual movement in America. But then in the last sentence, he sort of throws a definition in there at the last moment, which is, I find, a Buckley way to do things.
That's fantastic. And do you have that definition here with you?
Absolutely. So he writes, the symbiosis may yet be a general consensus on the proper balance between freedom, order, justice, and tradition. And I think that balance has always been key to the way Buckley thought.
And it certainly sums up our approach here at ISI. And I also like that a little bit earlier on that page, he also talks about how the way of freedom is wide enough to accommodate several different views, from the traditionalism of Russell Kirk to the libertarianism or classical liberalism of F.A. Hayek, and many others. So we're all about fostering that conversation here between the different strains of conservatism at ISI. So before we get to the interview with Mr. Buckley, a brief word about our show. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to join us in that mission, head over to isi.org and sign up to get free exclusive offers, content, the Intercollegiate Review, and this podcast in your inbox every week. Now, let's get to our interview.
Well, now, translating those two terms to the classroom in terms of academic freedom, suppose you have on the one hand a university professor who was remarkably conservative in his views and another who was remarkably liberal. Can you see any circumstances in which either of these men might be justified in making these views known to his class?
Oh, yes. I think under almost all circumstances, a professor ought to allow his views to be known to his class. It's true that that in certain disciplines it becomes almost wholly immaterial, but not always. Even in chemistry, for instance, it does make some sort of difference, whether one is a liberal or a conservative, let's say, theologically speaking. It has to do with the whole quality of the intellectual approach. But by and large, I think that it's impossible to teach economics or history or any of the social sciences or even some of the humanities without your views becoming known. I knew the political views of every teacher who taught me at Yale, even the apolitical ones. And it wasn't because they signed a declaration of political principles ahead of time, but because it just sort of oozed out of them.
Well, how are you going to keep these views within bounds, then, where you have young students easily impressionable and a professor of senior years and experience who holds the place of importance in the classroom?
Well, one has to define what the bounds are. I myself draw the same line that Professor Sidney Hook draws, namely that the views of communists are intolerable for slightly different reasons from Mr. Hook. But in any case, I do think that here are bounds about which many people would agree, including the National Education Association and a few other professional groups. Now, beyond that, you have to ask yourself, what do you agree is the purpose of education? If a university seeks to forward knowledge and right conduct and make certain corporate commitments in behalf of, let's say, racial toleration, then presumably it does not want on its faculty people who agitate in a contrary direction. We don't see taught in the United States courses on anti-Semitism 10 AD, for instance, and I think that this is a very good thing. This indicates that we are prepared to make certain corporate judgments. Where you get into trouble is when you try to define the line a little bit narrower than this. For instance, I believe that Yale University would have the right, should it choose to do so, to say that they intend corporately to favor the idea of individual freedom as opposed to, say, the domination of a superstate. And that in doing so, I think they would be perfectly entitled to weight the economic department in favor of the free enterprise system or the free marketplace system. You might consider this an abuse of academic freedom.
Are you suggesting that essentially then knowledge consists of what one holds in terms of belief or the methods by which he arrives at it?
It depends. I was not talking epistemologically here. I was talking about the recognition of a university of the function of passing along a patrimony of truths. Now, you asked the epistemological question, how do you know what's true?
Or who decides what is true?
That it is the task of all human beings to make moral commitments, even at the risk of falling to error. You may be wrong in saying, I consider it right and true that I should treat my neighbor decently. But nevertheless, until you are proved wrong, it is rather right that you should take such a stand than that you should take the position that you are afraid to treat your neighbor decently because it may be proved wrong by some experimental Harvard professor in the future. This is an improper attitude.
A short time ago, I had the opportunity to read through your latest book entitled Up from Liberalism. The terminology is somewhat disturbing to me. I wonder what you meant by the word liberalism and what you meant by the two prepositions that preceded it.
Well, what I meant by liberalism was described on page 4. You got that far.
Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view.
Well, I meant up from liberalism, and of course you got the crack, and I happen to believe that liberalism is an empty philosophy, the ravages of which are a monument to the first 50 years of the century. And in saying up from liberalism, I meant to suggest that my highest hopes for human destiny are that we will turn our back on some of the superstitions of liberalism and rise on to noble pursuits.
For example?
For example, that we should not consider that it is necessary to liberalism to leave forever enslaved the 900 million people which an essentially, quote, liberal foreign policy has permitted to become enslaved. That's, for example, that people should become more certain about the purposes of human existence, so that they should cease to be explained purely in methodological terms, which liberalism, of course, relies upon exclusively, such as that we shall, as a people, adopt an eschatology, which liberalism, of course, does not bequeath us. Liberalism is simply a loose agglutination of methodological principles that deny metaphysics, that rely primarily on positivism and pragmatism, and that suggest the emptiness with which so much of the West faces its current problems.
Mr. Buckley, I read in a report the other day that for the year 1960, large corporations gave gifts to universities in excess of $500 million. We would be interested in your reaction to what effect you think this may have upon the practice of academic freedom in the universities where these gifts were endowed.
I think it will have virtually no influence whatever, because, Dr. Rice, I urge you to face a rather formidable reality, and that is that the foundations are dominated by exactly the same people who dominate the colleges. It is precisely the same sociological group. If you were to pick 100 professors at random from Harvard and Columbia and Stanford, and stick them in a room somewhere and have them dispense a few $1 billion, they would not have acted in any way different from the way the Ford Foundation acted during the past 5 or 6 years. It's the same group.
Well, now, at the present time in this community, Mr. Buckley, we have at Indiana University and at Butler similar situation in that both of these universities are seeking for new presidents. I wonder if you'd give us a little gratuitous advice on some of the qualities you think such a man would have, so that he would not only be a good administrator, but would be properly aware of academic freedom for his faculty and the students as well.
I'd like to see a president, Dr. Rice, say something like this on the day of his inauguration as president. I'd like him to say, I believe that in the past 3,000 years of a systematic approach to learning, we've learned something. Otherwise, the entire academic experience is frivolous. I believe not only in the pursuit of truth, but in the possibility of the occasional apprehension of certain truths. I do not believe that people are coming to my university at age 18, 19, 20, and 21 knowing as much about the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors as our ancestors know, or as I, the president, knows, or as the faculty know, who have been studying and agonizing over it for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So I am accepting certain positive goals, and I will consider that I have miseducated these students if they go through here for 4 years without recognizing that these are the goals, that this is some of the distilled wisdom of the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. To the extent that academic freedom says that all ideas should start even in the race, I'm against academic freedom.
But specifically, what are the qualities that he would have to do this? And by what means would he accomplish it?
Well, courage, for one thing, because he would be the object of all of the little scorpions that the academic community knows so well how to loose on anybody who dissents from the prevailing academic orthodoxy. So courage, above all. A second is, of course, a certain amount of confidence in the fidelity his general analysis. It is one that can draw on Milton, it can draw on Newman, it can draw on St. Thomas, and it can draw on other great educators. So actually that there is a tradition for this approach to education, which only the positivism and relativism of academic freedom tended to turn into disrepute rather recently.
Mr. Buckley, I have a question which is concerned with loyalty oaths and in a sense with academic freedom. I'm thinking of situations which arise where members of university faculties, for example, are called upon to sign and offer loyalty oaths as a condition of employment. I'm thinking of the sort of thing that Section 9H of the Taft-Hartley Act puts upon a member of a labor union if he happens to be the chairman of it or the head of it in order to obtain certain benefits for his union. Can you think of any way in which professors, for example, who refuse to take the loyalty oath, but who are nonetheless loyal and patriotic citizens, but who refuse to take the oath solely on the basis that it represents an interference with academic freedom, can be protected from the smear in the public press which usually results when this happens?
Well, I think that the public press should, in cases like that, feel a considerable responsibility to distinguish between the professor who, for idealistic reasons, refuses to sign, and the professor who refuses to sign because there is evidence on the basis of a study of his career that he would be embarrassed by having to make a profession of loyalty which might subsequently be challenged in a perjury proceeding. I couldn't agree with you more that the press should very carefully distinguish between the two. Now, I happen to feel that professors ought to be prepared to sign such a loyalty oath. The reason I do is because of the crisis of our age. That is to say, I think that at all corners of our society we look for forms of commitment at a time when the West is in distress. But I also honor, and in a perverse way value, the professor who says that I won't do it. But the importance of dissent, and the important thing to remember about dissent, is that the person who dissents has got to take the consequences of dissent. It was never stated in our society and any other that a person who decided to be an eccentric or decided to be a dissenter should not take the consequences, should not be prepared to face the opprobrium. The trouble with ours, we almost want sort of a social security welfare for people who dissent, which means that the implicit bravery and courage of dissent loses all possible meaning. So if a professor chooses to defy the will of the society and of the community and of the private institution, let him do so and let him be prepared to seek employment elsewhere. Just as I, as a conservative, would have to face, I am quite prepared to face the opprobrium, as I continually do, of people who disagree with me, and I don't want anybody to guarantee me that all liberals will hire me to teach in their colleges simply to protect me.
But then haven't you given this man the alternative of either speaking his mind and being a courageous dissenter with the probable risk of losing his job, or else not being a disciple of freedom in the sense of thought and action, but at the same time facing sanctions which will keep him out of university?
Dr. Rice, you should bear in mind that all societies insist on a certain level of conformity, and that which distinguishes the free from the unfree society is the percentage of those sanctions which are social rather than legal. It is quite correct, for instance, for our society to boycott people who are anti-Semitic. The kind of drive that exists in the United States against the anti-Negroes in the South, the genuine racists, is quite correct. We should exercise that kind of a drive because this is the way we try to create a consensus without having to reach for the policeman to effect it. So I say that the professor the professor must not complain about the social workings of the society, which are actually precisely those gastric juices that produce beneficial results in the long run. There must be a conformity. There must be conformity in any society if it is going to cohere, a consensus of a certain kind.
Mr. Buckley,
and that consensus is especially challenged in terms of our present crisis.
Let's pursue that a minute. Mr. Buckley, I find from a theological perspective your position is very interesting liberalism. That is, in the view you've expressed about the the truth, the body of truth piling up, the total knowledge of mankind growing, and you pass this on from generation to generation. I believe you started off saying something like this as we began here. Now, what I should like to know, picking up the last comment you made here, by what criteria do you decide in a dynamic society what is really truth here if it is evolutionary? How do you know what is right and what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what ought to be passed on, what not passed on? Is it by majority of position?
No.
Is it by values of some sort? Who determines these values? By what process do you work here?
Well, there is no process that covers the entire spectrum of truths to which you are alluding. Certain quote truths are popularly arrived at by simply a political referendum. That is to say, it is not either more true or less true that one should have a monarchy, let's say, and it's simply whatever the people decide.
So, Johnny, what did you think of what Mr. Buckley had to say?
Yeah, that was a fascinating interview. I think the thing that really stood out to me about academic freedom was Buckley's point that, you know, you're going to expect a professor's political views, religious views to come out at some point in their class, especially if it's a class on the humanities. But the important question is where we draw the boundaries of what is beyond the pale. And that's an increasingly challenging question to answer in America today. You know, if you go all the way back to George Washington's farewell address, he's talking about the American people, and he says, with slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. They also had the common experience of fighting the revolution together. You know, you really can't say that today in America, so it becomes increasingly hard in a society where we have a wide fragmentation of views about the most fundamental things of human existence, human nature, what it means to be a male, what it means to be a female. How do we develop that consensus on what the boundaries of allowable opinion are? It's a tough question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some scholars have pointed to maybe natural law as being some way to do that, you know, but obviously we can't even agree on natural law anymore. So it becomes tougher and tougher.
I think natural law is a fantastic guide. I just don't know how to prevent people's eyes from glazing over as soon as, you know, one of our friendly philosophers goes and begins talking about it, just because, you know, to really understand natural law. I mean, there's an easy on-ramp to understand it if you're willing to listen, but it still is so alien from the perspective of most students in college today.
Maybe another point that Buckley brought up in the interview was, you know, what is the purpose of higher education? Maybe this could be a more common way that we could get after this, right? Because maybe the left and right could come together on some vision of higher ed. So can I ask you, I mean, what do you think the purpose of higher education is? Why should people dive into a liberal arts education or something like that?
Well, I agree with Buckley on this, that the pursuit of truth is the first component, but the second component is really the belief that you can arrive at an apprehension of truth. Now, it might not be the complete truth, but you're not just pursuing truth because you like to go for the ride. You're actually hoping that it leads you somewhere that will help to make you a better person, a better father, better mother, better citizen. What about you?
I agree. I mean, the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty, I think would be the answer. And I think it's important to remember that there are errors on both sides of that apprehension of truth, right? There's the side in which you can think, well, I can ascertain all truth, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's the other side that says there is no truth. And we sort of have to have limits on both sides of ourselves. I think that's, you know, a very strong conservative principle, is sort of thinking about the limits of humanity. You know what I mean? And in Buckley's answer, he's calculating that in.
Yeah, absolutely. Another interesting point that stood out to me is his comment that if academic freedom means that all ideas are equally true and start from the same place, then he's against it. Another point that sort of begs the question, who is the arbiter of what is true, what is false, what makes it into the canon and the core curriculum, and what doesn't? And I largely like Buckley's, his observation that the way to go about this is by reviewing the distilled wisdom of the centuries for the past 3,000 years. From my perspective, you know something's true if it stood the test of time. And so I think that's a good place to start.
It allows us not only to learn new things about which people might not be thinking about today, right? If you're only reading contemporary authors, you might be missing a whole section of knowledge that no one's talking about right now. But also it allows us to sort of learn and get better. It's this sort of, it's the conservative idea of progress, right? The one that says, well, we know this is true because it worked for our ancestors, and we can sort of slowly move forward with that in mind and bring it with us.
That's right. So what do you think about, how will students receive this in today's culture?
Yeah, I mean, so when Buckley's talking about the perfect president, the perfect university president. Thank you. He says one of the things that they need to do is to be able to look at students and say, you don't know more than our ancestors. So I think it's hit or miss what students will think today. I run into a lot of students in ISI programs who are more than willing to sort of sit at the feet of the great tradition and learn from it. But I also run into a lot of students who have no interest in listening to what the great tradition has to offer. And so I think to students today, this is, in some ways, this can be a little odd, a little archaic. I'm not sure why.
Another thing that I think was interesting on the topic of academic freedom is back in 1940, when one of the first widely publicized statements about academic freedom came into place. It was really, about there was a question of whether or not communists should be allowed to teach in the academy, and Buckley said basically no to that question. But some of the origins of academic freedom came by professors who wanted their political views and their participation in political parties to be protected, and they didn't want that to be a disqualifying factor for their role as a professor at the university. So I think it is interesting to see over the past 70 years how things have shifted. Well, it started out largely being people on the left that were committed to free speech and academic freedom, calling for some protections. Today, it's mostly people on the right who are attempting to sort of resist the woke, the guidelines of woke culture that are often requirements now to teach at many universities, at least assenting to these woke principles. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I was having a conversation recently with one of our faculty members, and he said to me, James, they at the beginning of the semester, they passed around a diversity statement, right? Or like this sort of woke, a petition, so to speak. And he was like, I can't sign this. There's no way I can possibly sign this. But my department loves me, right? He's publishing books. He's doing great stuff. He's really at the top of his field. And he said, but I'm not going to sign the document. And the university's not doing great financially. Like there's all these issues because of COVID. So it's
what ended up happening.
He did not sign the document, and he has yet to be fired. But we pray for him, because these people are really actually in a very tough spot when you think about it, because it takes away not only their ability to teach well. Some of the he's a constitutional scholar, so it doesn't just take away some of their ability there. It also just takes away their ability to, act in the way that they think they ought to.
That's a good point. Another thing that I liked from Buckley's comments was his emphasis on the importance of dissent. He said the key thing, though, is that the dissenter should be prepared to face the consequences of their dissent, which requires bravery and freedom, which sounds like something that your professor friend is willing to do. But I do think it's a good reminder, even for conservative organizations, to still, even if there is a core kind of consensus in terms of the values that guide the university, to still make room for dissent, even if it's a small dissent, because I think where there's dissent, there's room to learn and grow, and it also helps to keep us intellectually honest so we don't form echo chambers.
One of the things that I think is so important to conversation, right, is the willingness to come out a slightly different person. And if you don't allow any room for dissent, you can't possibly come out of a conversation a slightly different person, right? Yeah. You might come out more radicalized, but, that's right. But you won't end up having any more information about the others. Can I ask, what do you think in the role of, there's sort of a lot of counter institutions coming up today, right? There's a lot of counter academies, right? Hillsdale, Grove City, places like that, Patrick Henry, what role does academic freedom play there, right? Because is that a better move for academic freedom, or is that a worse move, right? It's sort of going off into the hills, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when I was at Hillsdale, it really wasn't that political of a place, which might sound surprising because the students are obviously, by and large, very politically conservative. But people were really just there because they love to read the classics, history, philosophy, great works of literature, to debate different Christian denominations and traditions with each other. It was really, a place where there was a lot of intellectual curiosity and debate and exploration, even though it was certainly largely from a conservative perspective. There were some outlier professors, specifically in the language departments. I know, some of my favorite French professors were much more on the liberal side of things, which is always a bit of a surprise, but was also somewhat refreshing to see kind of a counter perspective here and there. So I do think it's important, even for places like Hillsdale and Grove City, to think strategically about what voices from the left or the center left, might play a role on their faculty.
I think, when students do really get the opportunity to dive into the great tradition rather than sort of come in thinking, okay, I'm going to come out a woke warrior, or I'm going to come out a conservative warrior, it's instead redirecting them to the tradition and just saying, take it in. I think that's right. That's the most important thing there.
Absolutely. And one more question for you, James, sort of in your work, visiting college campuses, meeting with students and professors, it's easy to think that when Buckley was talking about the state of academic freedom back in 1959, that there might still be some hope for sort of reforming the university, for finding that university professor that Buckley describes, who loves to pursue, sets out the vision of pursuing and apprehending truth. Do you think it's possible to see that kind of reform in those universities and the major institutions today, or are most of them beyond reforming? And if they are, what is ISI's mission?
Yeah, I think some institutions are certainly beyond reform. I think there are ways in which it seems to me that whenever students come to me and they're like, man, I can't do this event because this administration's all over me. I'm like, well, who in your administration? Is it the university president? And they're like, no, it's the, diversity and inclusion officer. It's the student programs guy. It's this middle administration level that's causing most of their problems. So I think there are some, maybe reforms there that could happen. But, nonetheless, ISI exists on campuses all across the country as a home for people who are interested in diving into the Western tradition, the conservative intellectual tradition. It's not, their university might be a lost cause, but their education is not, right?
That's
because
right.
They can step into ISI and just take it in with their peers. There's ideas and in the ISI community.
Yeah. And many of them have that, the ISI societies on campus. If they don't, you can reach out to James and figure out how you can start one. There are ISI professors who can help mentor students and guide them in terms of which courses and which professors they should take at their university. And then also a number of universities, even at much more liberal schools, have centers that are established where they have conservative professors serving as fellows, and quite a few other programs where they can get involved and continue learning.
And I think the institute model, is growing, and we're grateful for that.
Great. Well, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all the other things that we offer to our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.